Hi, today we're looking at the risks of investment migration and the things you need to watch out for. Risk number one, will you actually settle and will you like it? Well, any move is always fraught. You could be moving down the street or around the corner and still not like the place you're in compared to where you left, or feel that it's not quite as suitable for you as it was. Now, the further you go, the more those risks multiply. But at the same time, if you're going through this in a well thought out, structured process, hopefully that won't happen. I think when people haven't moved countries before, the first time they move is always a bit of a shock, because little things that you take for granted are always much, much more different in a new place, and you don't always realize what those things are going to be. The more different places you've lived in, the easier it is to settle in the next one. Things like, what you do online and what you have to do face to face. Can you send an email or something, or do you still have to go and get an original document stamped and signed and go and stand in a queue for hours in a language that you don't speak? All those little practical admin hassles are the things. Can you register your car, or do you have to actually go to an office and stand in the queue, or someone do that for you? These little things, it's not always easy to find out where to find out how to do the small stuff. Yes, this is like any international move for work or for family reasons. If the kids don't settle in school, one of the parents is unsettled because the kids aren't happy, and that spreads over the other parent, and before you know, you've got to make some choices. But yes, it does happen. But that will happen with any school move as well. The question is, do you persevere or do you give up and go back? And I think it depends on how easy or difficult it is to go back. Well, the best way to check the place is right for you is to go there. Spend a little time, walk around, see what it's going to be like to live there. See if you can actually visualize yourself living there, or if just the noise and the heat or the cold or the pace of life is anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. Because if you think, I can't see myself living there, it feels too foreign, you're not going to maximize your chance of succeeding. It does happen that people don't like it and go back, and they end up coming back quite quickly. Usually something else has happened to make them come home. They weren't expecting a parent to get ill, or they've moved for a career opportunity and the job wasn't what was promised to them. But yeah, the people do go back. And again, it's the emotional detachment of going back on your word and saying hello to all the friends you just had the goodbye party with that can be difficult. But yes, it's not every move always works. So that's risk number one. Will you actually settle and will you like it? Let's look at risk number two. So risk number two is the logistics and practicalities of living abroad. If you've moved to a location but your business is tied to another place, you're going to still have connections with your home country or your previous place of residence, and you're going to still need to be operating in that time zone or flying there regularly to keep up with your business or your income. And if the more you've got to travel, the further you've got to go, the more difficult it potentially becomes, because you're then going to be spending a lot of time on planes or in airports. Yeah, so even what looks like a 2.5 hour flight becomes a 5-hour trip once you've got the airport early, checked in, waited, and then you add a small flight delay or an incoming plane being late, and suddenly that can be 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. And if you think, okay, well, I can manage 5 hours every other week, and suddenly it's 8 hours, maybe it's not as much fun as you think it is going to be, and that may then impact your quality of life negatively. However, if everything can be done remotely, or you've got passive investments and income, that obviously reduces those risks quite significantly. I think when unexpected things happen, a business is running smoothly and the key person leaves, or a transaction comes along and the person that was expecting that they could run it hands off from a distance suddenly finds they need to be there in real time, then they will need to then adjust to that. Now, of course, if you've moved primarily for tax reasons and you're claiming to be non-resident, then suddenly unexpected returns can then mean that your whole non-residence planning goes out the window. So it's something you've got to watch out for very, very carefully. Integration very much depends on the place you're going and how many other people there are that are like you, that are there for the same reasons. If you're one of a small number of people in a small village in the mountainside where everybody else is local, you might struggle much more to integrate than if you're in a big city where everybody else in your locality is a foreigner that's there for the same reasons as you are. And particularly if you've got school-age kids and you've got an international school nearby, and that's often a good community hub to start from. But it varies by the place. Language is always an issue. The more you can learn the language of the country you live in, the easier it's going to be to do the basics. Because when, I've found in my own experiences of living in places where I didn't speak it, the sheer feeling of powerlessness when you can't even order a cup of coffee becomes embarrassing at some point. But, the more effort you make, some countries are very good whether people just appreciate you trying. You don't have to be perfect immediately, but everything you do that makes it easier helps. The unspoken, unquantifiable bit is the culture. And of course, if you're in a country where they don't drink and you like a beer on a Friday night, then you might be in the wrong place. If you're in a religious country and you're not that religious, then you've got to be sensitive to that. I think all of these things you need to check before you move somewhere, and then just understand it. I think most of the time people try and get these things sorted out before they go. Occasionally they will find that it just doesn't quite work for them. Whether it's never usually one issue that causes things to really fall apart. It's usually a combination. But if you've done your research and you do diligence, it shouldn't trip you up too much. But there may just be certain things, like shops aren't open on Sundays, and Sunday is always your day for doing shopping because you're so busy during the week. You either adapt to that or you don't. The easiest way to assess how that's going to work for you is, have you done it before? What's it been like every time you've changed location, when you've had a new house, when you've gone off to college or started a new job in a new town, or when you moved in with your partner? How well do you adapt? How well do you adjust? And if you're adaptable, then you've got a reasonable expectation that you might also adapt in this situation. If you've always struggled with that thing, think carefully. So that was risk number 2, logistics and practicalities. Let's look at risk number 3. Risk number 3, my favorite subject, tax and the financial side. When you're moving to a new country, you've really got to understand the tax system there before you go, because some things you should do before you move and some things can wait until afterwards. If you've got certain transactions and gains that you want to realize and recognize, sorting out whether to do that before the move or after the move is important, because if you leave it too late, you can suddenly find something's being taxed that you weren't expecting to be taxed. Some of the biggest tax risks people make are just not understanding how the different tax systems overlay. If you may have a saving or an investment that's tax exempt in the country you're coming from, don't assume it's going to be tax exempt in the country you're moving to. And so interest and dividends in a savings vehicle that have been happily non-taxed for years, suddenly you might find you should be including in the tax return in the country you've moved to. Assets that aren't taxed in one country, you may have a wealth tax in another. Or if you've sold your house and you've got a capital gain, some countries exempt that, some don't. So if you've delayed selling your house until after you've moved and suddenly you find that that is going to be taxable in the second country, you could be in for a nasty shock. The biggest challenge sometimes is if you've got a complex work situation where you need to travel and be in different places. If you've moved somewhere to become a tax resident of that country and you don't spend enough time there to become a tax resident, you can then find that some of your planning has gone out the window because other countries might still want to tax the income that you've got there because you haven't broken residency or you're not resident in a different country. So that's always something to watch out for. 2 countries have the right to tax income, the country where the income is and the country where the taxpayer lives. As long as you're very, very clear on those before you move and who gets to go first and who gets to tax it second, you shouldn't have too many surprises. However, you do need to look at these things. And if you've got savings and investments in a third or fourth country, maybe somewhere where you've lived before or where someone told you is a good investment, you've got to be very, very careful to be sure that you understand it. Best thing to do is find yourself a tax advisor that specializes in this. Others are available, of course. It's quite common to not quite understand things correctly and then find out that you've done something that's triggered you a tax liability that you weren't expecting, even as simple as bringing in capital from another country where it's been earned and not being careful about which bank account you've taken that out of. You might have savings and investments that were old or capital that was clean that you could have brought in without it being taxed. And yet if it was more recent and it hasn't been taxed during a period you're a resident and you bring it in, you might find that that's taxable. So you've always got to be careful. Not every $10 bill is the same when it comes from different series of bank accounts from a tax man's perspective. The risk of using AI is that it's only as good as the information that it is searching on. And when there's a lot of, you've seen some of our videos where we've looked at other tax advice and questioned how good it is, then imagine if your AI is using that to make you a complex investment decision, you might want to double check that. That was risk number 3, the tax side. Let's look at risk number 4. If you've made an investment, is that risky in itself and does that have risks of its own? Investment migration means you're either investing in typically real estate or financial asset, whether that's a bond or a fund or government debt. So you've got to be comfortable with these asset classes and understand which ones only go up and which ones might go up and down. Real estate tends to go up over a long time, but it doesn't always. And sometimes if you are If you've bought new at the time of a boom and then you're selling later when everyone else is trying to sell, you may not always get the best price. If you're investing in a financial asset, if it's a government bond, usually those are relatively safe unless something happens to the government. But a venture capital tech startup fund will have the same volatility as a tech startup fund in any other country. So as long as you understand the type of investment you're making and you don't assume it's going to be massively different because of the country it's in, add a bit of country risk premium in there as well for not understanding, and then you can manage those risks. But investments all have risks by their very nature. They'd be called savings if they weren't. There are two factors that come into play. They're what investments that individual country accepts and what the person wants or likes to do. So people that like a lot of real estate investment in their own country often will gravitate towards a country that allows a real estate investment. Others that are private equity and hedge fund type people may much prefer somewhere where they can make a financial investment. It's the combination of the country and the quality of life and the lifestyle that you're looking for and the nature of the investment class that tends to drive the best investment migration decisions. As it says in the small print, all investments can go down as well as up. And that's one thing that always has to be considered. But again, if you invest in carefully or prudently, you can then hedge that risk. And you've got to consider how much of a percentage of your entire net wealth that is to consider how much you're prepared to put at risk. Smartest way is to just take advice from as many sources as possible. Only go into an investment you're sure about. If it's a financial investment that's required in that country, look at who the broker of that is, the provider, and then see what their history is and their how big the institution is, whether they're a long-standing one of a good reputation or somebody you've never heard of. That's risk number 4. Let's go to the last one, number 5. Risk number 5 is government and policy changes. Most countries that have these programs for investment migration tend to have them for medium to long term, but often the political climate can change and at some point they decide they no longer wish to have investment migration in that category. So the thing to look out for is the speed at which you're making that investment, because if suddenly a window closes or you can no longer use a certain category of investment, you've got to then be cognizant that there's going to be a limited time to make that application. So if you thought, well, I'd like to go there in a few years' time, there's no guarantee the program's still going to be open in that form in that time. However, once you've applied for something, you've been granted something, you very rarely find that that deal gets gone back on by the government involved, because they still want a good relationship with foreign investors and they want to keep the money that they've already attracted in the country. Well, rules have changed. I mean, in 2023, Portugal closed down the real estate asset class for investment. So now you can only invest in Portugal through a financial investment rather than a real estate one. So people that were in the process, they had enough time to close that deal. They were told in advance. Spain did the same in 2025 with its golden visa. So these things do change over time. Most countries do give you enough warning, enough notice. Italy doubled the flat tax from 100,000 euros to 200,000 euros in summer 2024. So people that had applied under the old regime still get to keep the 100,000 flat tax rate. People that applied after that date have to pay the 200,000. But of course, they had the option of not submitting that application if they didn't want to. If you've applied in time for the deadline, then those rules tend to get respected. No one's going to change the rules on you retrospectively afterwards. And of course, if they do, you've got the option of leaving again. Before a program closes, you usually see some indication, whether it's in the newspapers about a new government saying that, house prices are too high because all the foreigners are buying all the expensive houses rather than accepting their own blame for not building enough new ones. Or there's a change in the sentiment towards certain nationalities being there, or there will always be an indication that something's happening, but the closing of the program may be announced with relatively short notice. But anyone that's still in the application's been lodged should still be able to get in, or people that are part of the way down the process of getting their documents together will know that they've got a few weeks or a few months to just hurry through and get that done, because there's been a closing date announced. The single most important factor is look at where you're going and do you feel you could live there, both from a lifestyle perspective and a family perspective, but also networking and work perspective. Can you do all the things you need to do from where you are, or do you have to keep jumping on the plane more than you expected? and make your quality of life negatively impacted by moving somewhere. As long as you've done all of your homework there, it should work out okay. The way to minimize the risk is actually identify the risk beforehand, go through that list, same as you would approach any other risk. What are the risks? What are the issues? What potentially can happen? And what would we do if these things happen? How do we deal with this? If you've got those kind of conversations had, if you're going as a couple or a family, talk about it all together before you go, and then you're clear. If you want the advice on where to go, the best place to start is with the Henley & Partners website. Look at the different countries, and a consultant or a client advisor will take you through not only from the individual countries and the programs, but what's right for you as a person and an individual and a family to make sure that the investment and the country go hand in hand and that you settle successfully there.